This is Sarah Levitt with the Making Magnificence Project. And today, I'm super excited. My guest is Dr. Jill Carnahan, MD, a functional medicine expert. She is duly board certified in family medicine for 10 years and in integrative holistic medicine. She's the founder and medical director of Flatiron Functional Medicine, a widely sought after practice with a broad range of clinical services, including functional medicine consulting, chiropractic therapy, physical therapy, naturopathic medicine, acupuncture, and therapeutic massage. I didn't know you did all that. As a survivor of breast cancer, Crohn's disease, and toxic mold illness, she brings a unique perspective to treating. And she is the brand new author of Unexpected: Finding Resilience Through Functional Medicine, Science, and Faith. Welcome, Dr. Jill, to the Making.
Thank you, Sarah. I am so happy to be here with you. I know we're going to have fun and dive deep.
We're totally. And just as a disclaimer, so none of this is intended as medical advice or guidance. And Dr. Jill is my functional medicine doctor. And so just kind of full kind of transparency there. So let me kind of think about, because I loved this book. I told you I listened to it on audio so I heard you, and be all the emotion associated with your journey. And this is a very personal book. We're going to go there. Like, I was really taken with how incredibly personal it is and how transparent in just a beautiful way. And this is the first in a series of conversations for the Making Magnificence Project on journeys of healing. So you are a leader in your field, and you're also a healer, and we're going to be talking about your own journey. So let's start, if you're okay, let's start with the book. So why this book, Dr. Jill, and why now?
Yes, and it's so interesting when you talk about the audio version. It was like 2012 when I was on a retreat, just prayer meditation for several weeks. At that time, I was married and my spouse was out of town for like 5 weeks. I had all this time. And I remember like really getting a download from the universe, like, you are going to write a book. And I kind of like argued or do that. You like argue with like, what is it? And I was like in this place of like, no, I don't know what I'm doing. And I'm not enough. And all those things, right, that I've been working through. But back then I literally was like, oh my gosh, what if I don't write it right? What if I can't write it right? All those questions. And it was almost like an audible voice was like, no, all you have to do is tell your story. That's it.
Yes.
I'll do the rest.
Yes.
And I was like, and whatever that voice was, it was maybe me with indigestion, but whatever it was, it was just like so clear that it was like, okay. And the thing is, when we release the expectations of others and ourselves on ourselves, it's actually quite easy. And we all have a story. I am not unique. And so I love talking story, because what happens is what you realized in the book with the intimacy and the vulnerability. When we go to those places, we're all human and we all have common fears and wins and healing issues. And so I knew that by going to those places, as hard as it wasn't really about, my goal in the book was so that I would tell my story, but it would just be a template so that the reader would reflect on their own journey. Knew that the only way that I could do that, if I stay up here and like, oh, well, I'm a doctor and I do this and I do this and like this bullshit, right? To be honest, if I don't go to that place of like, here's where I struggle, here's where I learned, here's where I'm growing, here's where I'm still growing, and really be vulnerable in that, in the common human elements, that's the only way it's going to touch people or impact people's lives. So I knew I had to go there. And what happened is 2012, there's a lot of years until I actually wrote the book. And what happened is I had to go through a lot.
10, 11 years, right? Because it's
Right,
brand new. Yeah.
I literally I wrote my journal in 2016 finally. No, I'm sorry, 15. I said, next year I'm going to publish and write my book. Like, that was finally the point. Well, then still, and what happened, I want to just frame this because people out there have these dreams or goals, and we underestimate what we can do in 3 to 5 years, but we overestimate what we can do in 6 months or a year. And I had done that whole time. But one thing that's probably the most important part was I surrendered to this timeline that was outside of me. I knew I was going to do it. There was never, ever a doubt that I was going to write a book and hopefully impact people. But that timeline, I let it go, and I trusted that the universe would bring all those things that were promised, like a publisher and like the help with the writing, a coach, or whatever things that I needed. And it happened in a time frame that I would have never expected, but it was perfect.
Nice. And so in your give me a sense of your health journey overlaid with the writing of the book. So between 2012 and 2022, 23, you've got mold illness in there. Is
Yes.
that right? Yeah.
And divorce and trauma and like I dealt with
Right.
so much stuff. And that's why I was like,
Yeah.
oh, the second half of the book had yet to be written. Right.
Yeah.
So
You know,
that's
it's a real, I know I've said this, but it's not only a story that's rich with events and emotion, um, and transparency, but it's very human, Dr. Jill. Like you really approach it as a person, not just as a doctor. Um, and talk about, yeah. So we'll get there. Hang on, I gotta put on my glasses because my eyes are just not what they used to be. Um, all right. So you are a functional medicine doctor. In addition to being a traditional MD, um, what is your work? What would you say your work is?
yeah, so I don't think I knew it, but I'm a healer.
Yeah.
I thought it was about studying medicine, and I actually grew up on a farm, one of 5 children. My mother was a retired nurse, retired to take care of all 5 of us, and so a really holistic minded. Like we grew at an apple orchard. We had a huge half-acre farm with lots of, or garden with lots of fresh produce that I helped to plant and pick and harvest and can and cook and freeze. And so I was very involved with understanding how food came to us and that we grew some of our own food and that there was this like direct connection to the earth and to the land and to nourishment. And then my mom was very like, I mean, we went to regular doctors, we went to the dentist. There was nothing weird about it, but she would always like try an herbal tea or try something more natural before she'd run to get an antibiotic. So there was also this idea that, oh, maybe if we eat well or take care of our bodies, that we could actually heal or prevent disease. So there was that mindset. And then even growing up, one of the main practitioners I saw was a chiropractor, even as a kid. So
Okay.
like my kind of primary care preventative medicine was from a chiropractor. And I never forget him giving me a book on nutrition. And I was probably 10 years old and I had this kind of aha of like, oh, food is medicine. So I had that. And then as I was looking at options, I went applying to naturopathic school and allopathic and medical school and acupuncture school and all of these different healing modalities. And then as I started getting acceptance letters to regular medical school, I thought, oh, it was almost like oh, maybe I could be a doctor
Yes.
because I
And you
realized
talk about this beautifully in the book. It's like, wow, me, a doctor? Yeah, 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 yeah,
I grew up with farmers and now my
yeah.
family's very, very smart. They're engineer, like they're not just the typical, they really study and education was a priority. So that was not uncommon, but I'm the first doctor in anyone in my generation. So that was a
Yeah,
big deal.
big
And I
deal.
also was a big deal because I knew just doing medications and surgery didn't align with what I believed to be healing. So I
Mhm.
knew I had to go through this form of training that didn't quite align with me. But what I ended up doing was kind of infiltrating, getting the best of conventional medicine. And also through that, I started an integrative medical club and started to kind of explore during medical school. And then coming out, I started to see as I learned what functional medicine was, I was like, oh, this is it. And for those of you who don't know, functional medicine is just really good medicine, root cause medicine, taking the best of all modalities and going to where did this start? How did this happen? How can we reverse disease?
So you say you regard yourself as a healer at this point. So all this tremendous experience, credentials, education. What does it mean to you to be a healer?
Yeah, it's interesting because that's part of the title, Faith Science, Right Brain, Left Brain.
Yeah.
It's kind of bringing in, because in my medical training and how I grew up, it was a very analytical engineering kind of the mentality of like analytical process, testing, uh, diagnosis, treatment, and that wonderful training. And I love that
Mhm.
part of my brain.
Mhm.
But the right brain is the more creative, intuitive part. And as I learned to realize, like actually integrate those, because in medical training and conventional training, there is not much credence give to intuition or to gut instinct. But the truth is that as we have wisdom and experience, that power of seeing the patterns and like having a deep knowing, like now when I listen to a patient's history, literally in the first maybe 15, 20 minutes, I have a deep sense of where to go and
Yeah,
what to
you do.
do. And
Yeah,
but before there would have been no value to that, right? Because it's not science, like the left
yeah,
brain, the classical hard
yeah.
science. But what I've learned is, oh my gosh, there is so much power there. And especially when you combine the intuition with that. And again, faith, science, right brain, left brain,
Yes.
intuition. It kind of takes both sides. And when you combine them, it's like this explosion of exponential knowledge and understanding. So when you say healer, back to your original question, the healer is really the one who sits and listens and creates a safe space of unconditional loving acceptance for that patient to
Mhm.
explore and to become the very best version of themselves.
No, and I can, yeah, I'm gonna get a little teary because I experience you that way for sure.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
Um, do you think part of this is just my own curiosity? Do you think part of what we think of as intuition is pattern detection, which comes from lots of experience, just seeing things over and over and over? I'm curious about
100%. And that's why
that.
it's
Yeah.
actually pretty good science. Like when they
Yeah.
do,
Yeah.
and they have done studies of doctors' gut instinct, and it's actually more accurate than like a clinical lab test. So it actually is. And what it is just like you said, you really can't, at say you're 19, you usually don't have a ton of intuition because you haven't had the life experience. So it does take a little bit of life experience and seeing cases and seeing situations. And the bigger thing, I always compare it like the old analog computer can maybe calculate 1,000 pieces of data in 30 minutes.
Yep.
But the
Yep. Yep.
supercomputer, which takes our subconscious into play, and it's
Mhm.
literally like the stuff we're not aware of, like someone walks in a room, how they're facing the door or facing us, or smiling or not smiling, or even our feeling of like you probably all walked into a room and you're like, someone just had an argument. You know, right? You know that feeling that's
Yeah.
heaviness, like
Yeah.
palpable in the room,
Yes.
and yet
Yes.
there's no other clues, like objectively. That's that instinct. And we actually
Yeah.
take in these pieces of data subconsciously, millions of parts per second, like instantaneously, we know. And that knowing actually comes from good science, but we kind of say, oh, that's not good science. But
Mhm.
it is. It's really, really
Mhm.
deep.
So your I have so much curiosity. So your journey as a healer, Dr. Jill, one might say you have come by it honestly. In the sense that your own, and you talk so openly about this in Unexpected in the book, your own journey has not exactly been a smooth path. So at the time you were diagnosed with breast cancer, was it the youngest woman ever to be diagnosed? Do I remember that?
That's correct. I was at
Yeah.
Loyola in Chicago, major
Yeah.
medical center. That was my training facility. And literally, it was like this big deal because I was the youngest. I was 20. I had just hit my 25th birthday. So technically, the biopsy was done at 24 and then 25 by the time they found the diagnosis, but literally around my 25th birthday. So
Yeah.
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 Now, sadly, there's more and more young people that it's
Yes.
happening to now. But at that time in 2001, it was the youngest.
So you're the youngest diagnosed with breast cancer. And then, and I was stunned when because I'm like, oh, she's coming through it. You know, I'm listening to the book. I'm like, she's coming through it. Fantastic. And then, boom, you were on rounds or something, but you're on the floor. You're running a very high fever. You're, of course, pushing through. Um, and did you collapse? Do I
Yeah.
remember you collapsed? Yeah. And that was Crohn's disease,
Yes.
which
Yes.
was no joke as well.
Right, right,
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
okay, here we go again, and
Yeah.
it's funny because, like, I
Like
look back.
on the
Yeah,
heels of getting through breast cancer, right? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
was still bald, I had, like, nubbins for
Yes.
hair, like,
Yes. Yeah.
and it's funny because you mentioned that, what happened, I look back, I'm like, "What in the world?" Back then, the residency, unless you were dead or in the ICU, you reported to work, and especially because I had just taken 9 months off, so I already thought I was appearing weak because I got sick, right? Like, there was this idea that you don't complain, you just show up, so I didn't feel like I even could tell people I was sick, and I'm working post, so I did chemo, radiation, surgery, kind of remission from cancer, okay, back to work, and
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
working with fevers up to like 102, and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
felt horrible. Didn't tell anybody because I thought, oh, maybe this is just post chemo. And then one day, like you said, I pass out, ended up in the ER with emergency surgery for an abscess.
And so Crohn's was its own journey. And it sounded to me, you tell me, it sounded that that was when you really started looking at the role of things like diet and lifestyle. Is that accurate?
Well, I did with the breast cancer, I did have a naturopath, I did some nutrition,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
I felt like because of the aggressiveness of my tumor, I had to go with all conventional,
Yeah.
like, the
Yeah.
standard therapy was 3 drug chemo, surgery, radiation, I did all of that,
Yeah.
so I couldn't do a ton of like, I didn't say, "Oh, I'm not gonna do conventional therapy, I'm gonna just do alternatives." I actually did all the conventional and then tried to restore myself after, but yes, you're correct, because all of a sudden my Crohn's, it's gut related, right? And I'll just tell this, I know you probably remember, I talked to my gastroenterologist, he tells me what the spiel is, this is lifelong, it's incurable, you're
Yeah.
probably gonna have surgery over your
It's a
life.
great scene in the book. Yeah. Yeah. It's a
Yeah,
great scene. Yeah.
and literally, like, all this stuff, I'm like, "Oh, great, this is not right," and I didn't know any better, I literally didn't know, I was asking genuinely because I wanted to
Yeah.
do what I could, and I said before I left, "Is there anything I can do, like, with diet?" And he didn't even pause, and he's like, "Jill, diet has nothing to do with this." And talk about intuition, there was a piece of me that I didn't know any better, but I was like, "That can't be true." So I went to prove him wrong, and
Yeah.
the story is that it diet had everything to do with me healing.
And then you had mold illness. How many years after Crohn's? So
Yeah,
I'm
so
like,
then that
these
was,
are big hits.
yeah,
These are
and I was
big.
doing pretty well for the next decade almost, got to, Boulder, Colorado, where my practice is, and
Yeah.
moved here and doing well, and then, the flood happened in Boulder,
Yeah.
massive
Yeah.
flood in 2013, and then a year or 2 later, I started feeling really, really exhausted and sick and brain fog and skin rashes, and I didn't know what it was, but eventually found out that there was massive mold in my office building.
You and I've talked about, like, I don't wish it on, having been through it
Right.
myself. I do not wish it on anyone. Um, so these are three significant life and health events. And as you said at the top of our conversation, there were also other things, big things happening, divorce and then dating, post divorce, all of that. How did, because I'm guessing it must have. So, how did these three big kind of health events, passages, whatever we want to call them, how did that influence you as a doctor and a healer?
Yes, what a great question, Sarah.
Because it's so clearly, to me, again, because you're my functional medicine doc, I experience you that way, but I'm curious about how these things shaped you. Yeah.
Yeah, well, first of all, on every one of those categories and more in autoimmune and some of these bigger picture things, I've been there in the sense that, like, I really know what it feels like to be faced with something that feels either insurmountable or scary. And so often when I'm watching or listening to the patient tell their story or being present with them, I can see either fear or like maybe doubt that I'm ever going to get well, or those things that I went through. Like I know it and I can usually recognize it because I'm like, yeah, I know how you're feeling.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny because we're taught, and so is like the field of psychology, the field of medicine, we're taught to have this like veneer, like we have it all together, which is BS, right? And
Totally.
then this patient is like there to we're holier than thou and supposed to help them. Ridiculous, right? Like we're human just like them. So I often be like, oh my gosh, I totally remember that. I know how you feel. And it's not that it's never about me, but by sharing those pieces, I'm like, I want you to know that you too can overcome it. And sometimes I feel like I can be the one that has the faith, the belief in something else, and you can borrow it. Like I'll loan you my faith because
Mm-hmm.
if there's one thing I've had my whole life, and this was just a gift, really from birth, is believing that something else is possible. And I call that faith. So whatever background you have,
Yeah.
but
Yeah. Yeah.
that belief, and I can loan that belief to the patient. And I think that's really powerful.
So speaking of faith, because that the subtitle of your
Yeah.
book, what is it? Faith, science, and what's
Functional medicine, science, and faith.
there we go. Um, how did those three kind of come together into a whole for you when you're showing up for your patients?
Yeah, and it's so funny, Sarah, because you know our world, like I was for at the beginning kind of afraid to even say faith on the
Yeah.
cover because people get such this idea, and that's why like whatever background you are, there's always a belief in some greater purpose, or if there isn't, there should be because there's a health advantage to that. And it doesn't have to be like the God I believe in. It can be whatever for you motivates you to thrive and to overcome. And so it can be a much bigger thing. And to me, it's really how do we deal with the uncertainty of life? Some people get insurance policies, some people try to save up money. And the truth is all that could go away. And so if we have our sense of safety in something other than something that is actually greater than ourselves, Like if it's our health, if it's our finances, if it's our relationships, all those things can fall apart. And then if we have our sense of safety in that, it goes down the drain and we're like in fearful trauma state. So I love to teach people to have this faith because uncertainty, things that are unexpected happen all the time. And if we have no idea of something greater, some greater purpose, some greater meaning, and when we do have that greater purpose or meaning or faith in something greater than ourselves, then when the suffering comes, not if, because it's going to
Mm,
happen,
mhm,
we can actually know, oh, there's something better, deeper, and more important here for me to learn, for me to grow, for me to transform. And even for like me telling my story or you telling your story or anyone telling their story about what's happened, it actually gives meaning or purpose to the suffering that you've had. And that's pretty profound. Like when you can take something that
mm.
happened that was horrible and you would never wish it on anyone and start to take it and teach and train and encourage and inspire or whatever you want to do with that, all of a sudden it gives meaning and purpose to something that could have been just a tragedy. And that's really my journey in life is to take and teach people how to make meaning and purpose out of really difficult, not fun things.
And so, did I hear you that it is in the telling of the story that gives the meaning to the
Yeah.
challenge? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. You have to.
I have to say, I was stunned. Like I'm listening to the book, and I'm like, okay, oh, she's through this, pretty horrendous treatment for breast cancer, and I'm like, she's passing out. What's happening? And then I'm like, what? Crohn's? Like, how could this be happening? And what struck me during the book was during your narrative was how often during pretty difficult times you would circle back to that faith and that sense of meaning, and is there something here that I can learn, that I can become more resilience is also, it seems, a theme. Is that, would you say? Yeah.
And that might be the real definition of resilience, isn't it? Like, how do we take something that was not meant for good or suffering or
Yeah.
difficulty and actually transform it
Yeah.
into something that actually creates a greater sense of strength? I'm at the point now, Sarah, that I really believe there's nothing that could come that I couldn't figure out or handle. And that's like it's a place that comes from a lot of suffering, but
Yeah.
it's actually a really neat place to be because I mean, granted, I'm human, I have fears, but I'm not really afraid of most of the big things because I've been through so much. And so I feel this real sense of like, even if something really bad happens in our world or I lose someone I love, I'm like, I know I'll be okay. And that knowing that we'll be okay no matter what happens is part of this resilience building.
That kind of inner kind of
Yeah.
peace and solidity.
Yeah.
Um, I've asked you so many questions. I'm not even like mindful of the questions I was thinking about asking you. So two things actually. What are you, because you see and treat people with a range of ailments, disease, challenges. Yes? Is that,
Yes.
what are you most curious about in your work these days? What are you kind of on your own learning edge about?
Ah, great question. Really good question. I don't know if I've ever been asked that. I would say, post-pandemic things shifted and medicine was already a little shaky as far as the stress on the system, the amount of people getting ill, the amount of people maybe not, either overweight, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer. There's just a lot of illness going on. And then I feel like it shifted to another level because now the mental health of our young people is at risk and epidemic numbers of depression, anxiety, long COVID. There's a study out of Stanford said 1 in 5, which is like 20% of these were young people that have symptoms that last longer than 3 months. So this is like epidemic. And then the system itself, where there's doctors, nurses, they're getting burned out. They're overwhelmed. They're like not getting, so there's like on every side of the system in the healthcare, it feels like it's kind of collapsing. Now, for me, I'm kind of in a separate bucket of the system because I feel like there are answers and this is actually the answer to the breaking of the system is going deeper, root cause, living well, teaching people how to overcome and actually empowering people so that they don't even need a doctor in some cases. And so I get excited about that. And I feel like as the onslaught of environmental chemicals, mold, all of these things, even just stressors psychologically come on, our systems are breaking. And we're seeing that in real time. And if you're out there, you know this because you've heard of someone dying at 20 or 30 or 40 of a heart attack, or you've seen young people that have severe mental illness that in the schools, and I could go on and on. So we all see the crisis. And I get excited because I really feel like not just functional medicine, but science, faith, functional medicine, resilience, these principles, these are the answers. Like, how do we dig deep and restore and then become environmentally conscious and start to take an ownership of the tragedies that are happening and the chemicals and all this? And granted, I could go on for an hour on this, but I think the future projects is how do we really get this message out?
To kind of a broader,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. One of the things that struck me in the book, in your own story, was kind of the revisiting of the past traumas, as you mentioned. Would you kind of speak to your own experience with that and what that meant for your healing and your future?
Yeah, this may be
There
the
was,
most
yeah, there were so many. I mean, I'm just thinking about the conversation with your dad. That
yeah.
exchange with your dad. It was so beautiful and poignant, and yeah,
Oh, that means a lot because I'll tell you, my dad and I have a great relationship. We always have. And if you would have asked me before I ever started delving into this, maybe a decade or two ago, I would tell you I had a perfect family. I had a great life growing up. And that's all true. Like there was no horrible abuse or any of that. And so to go to these little T's where it was like me as a 5-year-old feeling maybe that I wasn't good enough
yeah,
or feeling like I mean, you talk about big families. I was one of 5 kids. So how in the world can parents fully be there for every single one of the 5 kids, right? Like it's just a perception of our childhood self that feels like maybe I'm not enough, maybe I'm not important, whatever things that we do. But it wasn't that I had terrible parents. And it was so hard because I wanted to go to the depth of how much this affected me and how like I really did need to go to my dad and have a talk as a 40 something and say, hey, can we heal this? Is this a wound my little girl has? And I need your help. And
yeah,
you know what? Because he's such a great man, he
yeah.
was just beautiful. I wrote a letter and I basically from what I saw was this. I was dating after divorce and I was picking horrendously dangerous and psychopathic kinds of
I'm
relationships.
reading these and I'm like, oi.
How I know
No, no,
my
no. I mean,
next
I've
book,
believe me, I've dated my fair share of people I shouldn't have been
right?
dating. So I'm with you. I'm with you. But I was like, wow, this
Whoa,
is,
I know.
yeah.
The next book, this is just the teaser to the book. The next book is The Unicorn's Guide on How to Not Date Psychopaths.
I'll have to read.
So yes, or the Empath's Guide anyway. So
Right, the
that's
empath, totally.
but I clearly started to see like, oh my
Yeah.
goodness, why? And there was this wise part of myself that in the midst of it was like, why am I picking these guys? These are not winners. They're really bad characters and not good for me. But there was something, and so then I realized, oh, there's something younger, more deep that's like being drawn to these traumatic situations. I need to heal that so that I can go on to pick good partners and date healthy men. And in doing that, I realized, oh, there's a younger version of myself that just wants to be loved and accepted. So if some man who maybe isn't the best character gives me the perception of love and acceptance, I'm going to glomp onto that because it feels so good to my little tiny 5-year-old who
I
just wants,
totally identify with this. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so then I was like, oh, wait, this comes from father. And again, my father he is an amazing man. He is and was. He is truly, that's why I could go to him. Like he is just
Yes.
kind and generous and compassionate. And we had so many tears over this because he was so tender-hearted about it. Like I love him so much. But what I did is I sat in a coffee shop at 41, 42 years old and wrote a letter to my daddy. And I have never in my 40 years called him daddy. That's how much there was and I did, and I said this, and it turned out there was a time in his life where when I was having that wound, he was about to lose the farm. He was under so much stress of debt, which is how the crops go. And I had no idea. But guess what? As an empath, as a 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old child, I felt this weight on my father that I thought was me. It had nothing to do with me, right? Not a thing. And literally, 41, he writes back and tells me about this. I'm weeping on the floor, a mess, a hot mess.
I
Because
was weeping too. And I loved his initial response to you, which was I'm a paraphrase, and I'm doing this from memory, but essentially, thank you. Can I have 24 hours to respond?
yeah, like he even said, yeah,
Like
hey,
he
God,
wanted to
this is really
think.
important.
It's
Yeah, I
beautiful. Yeah,
loved it. And then I
yeah.
literally remember sitting in my kitchen that when the email came in and I fell apart because I was like, oh, and as I read it, just like my dad is, he was so kind and so loving. And he said, you are the most wonderful daughter I could ever want. You're so special in my life. I've always seen you as this. Like it was so healing. I still have that email. And again, it went to another level of like this. And I literally that day shifted how I dated
I
that
got
day.
that from the book. I was like, wow.
Yeah.
Because I've done a lot of deep work. I'm like, wow. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. So Dr. Jill, that that was kind of revisiting an old trauma or pain. Um, and so you've done that personally. You see it in your clients and in your patients. If someone can't have that kind of
Yeah.
conversation for whatever reasons with their parent, what would you kind of say to them? Or if if they're just challenged to revisit something in any way.
Oh, I love this question because so many people maybe have lost a parent, or maybe they just aren't talking, or what for whatever reason, there's zero judgment. And you may be in that situation where you know there's a wound that needs to be dealt with and you don't know how to do it. This is so important. We can actually reparent ourselves. And so it starts by, like, for me, I literally in the beginning had a picture on my phone of that 5-year-old girl, and I would talk to myself. And the funny thing is, as our adult self talking to our, I'd be like, oh, sweetheart, you were so brave. You're so strong. You were doing a great job. We can start to actually reframe those younger parts of ourselves. There's a lot of wonderful, Dr. Schultz, I believe, wrote a book called The Parts. It's about part work. It's about family constellations. And so if you want to look into that, you can read the books on it. But we have all these parts of ourselves, and part of them are younger selves that maybe we're stuck in this feeling like they're not enough, or they're whatever thing, whatever fear, whatever thing. But we can actually, as an adult, go back and reparent and encourage. We can even imagine ourselves taking our younger self by the hand and, like, hey, I'm here now. I'm adult. I know what's going on. I can protect you. I can love you. You're going to be okay. And we can literally have these conversations in our head. And believe it or not, it does heal parts of ourselves. You can also write a letter, and maybe you never send it, but you actually write out. There's a power to the pen and the hand. And a lot of my book was handwritten, not untyped. I mean, I would
Yeah,
later edit,
yeah,
but there's a power to doing that with your actual hand with a marker or a pen in a journal. And so I would encourage you to write out some of the thoughts and feelings. You might also see patterns, and I've done some work with generational issues too. So you might have this thing like, there's a phrase that comes to mind, and you realize, oh, my grandmother also had, like, there might be some patterns generationally that you can work through as well.
so for people who are, if I'm hearing you, kind of the revisiting, and you did this in your own life, kind of the revisiting of some very difficult memories or events, etc. You see as kind of key to healing.
Yes.
Um, why is that? What is it about healing, or for us in the future, that
Yeah.
requires that we kind of heal the past?
Totally. And I'm glad you're talking about this with healing, because I know supplements, diet, nutrition, lifestyle, like, there's so many ways that we heal. But I believe hands down the most powerful is dealing with our subconscious mind and our patterns and our younger selves that maybe went through things. And
Well,
I always like, yeah, and granted, some people out there have had horrible abuse or trauma, but most of us have had pretty decent lives. But there are patterns of thinking. And what happens is our subconscious is kind of it's brilliant and stupid at the same time. And what that means is anything that our subconscious believes to be true, it will just go forward, walking like a robot, making that happen. So if we believe we're unworthy, guess what we're going to make happen in our life? Situations that make us feel unworthy, or we get rejection, or we get dumped by a boyfriend, or we get whatever thing happens. Say we feel like we can't trust our intuition. Our body's going to tell us we have a stomach ache. We're like, no, I'm fine. We're going to override that. So whatever beliefs or patterns that we have that are ingrained in ourselves, and we have to kind of discover them, because very often we just inherit things from our parents, like the root of all evil is money, right? Like, that's one that keeps people from abundance and wealth, because they're afraid that that's actually bad. It's not. But you have to kind of discover, like, dig, like you're digging potatoes out of the ground. You're like, oh, here's one. Oh, it's I'm not worthy. Oh my gosh, here's one. I can't trust my intuition. I can't trust my body. I remember way, way back playing the piano at like 5 to 7 years old. I had lessons and I couldn't play the notes right all the time. And I literally would bite my fingers because I was so mad at myself for betraying myself. And then later, when I got cancer, I remember having these conversations around, like, my mind is strong. I'm going to med school. I'm trying to do this. My stupid body is betraying me. Like, think about that. That was anger at my own beautiful body, who was, trying to get through this. And I had to really resolve some of those self-hatred issues.
yeah.
And those are the kind of messages we all have at some extent to whatever lesson. So we have to first discover what they are. Then we have to rewrite the script.
How do we? So I think what you just described is so common for so many. which is the override. So the body says something, we have a somatic experience of something, and then we override. Um, what has been your path to kind of tuning in to what your body is saying?
Yeah. So, as this is probably being aired, our documentary Doctor Patient is coming out, which is like in a whole nother in-depth. So it's at drpatientmovie.com. You can watch it, rent it, whatever. That'll be out April 9th.
Savvy. Okay.
But all that to say, in there we go really deep with some of these, identifying the patterns and changing them because we all have them. And so you really want to first, you talked about ignoring your intuition. Um, the message that I went to the documentary because there was this acronym we used for the documentary called BLT, and it's believe, love, trust. So you have to believe in yourself, believe that there is a way. You have to love yourself, and you have to trust your intuition. So that BLT is the acronym that was why the movie was made. But I want to say if you don't trust yourself, meaning like if I have a stomach ache and you ignore it or you dissociate from it, or like say you grow up in a family where there's conflict and your parents are yelling at one another and you learn to dissociate from that, you read a book, listen to music, or you might feel an upset stomach when they're yelling, but you start to dissociate from that. We actually have learned dissociation from a young age in order to cope. And it's a really good coping skill because if someone's in a traumatic or difficult family situation, dissociating actually maybe saves their life. Like it really can
Yeah.
help.
Yeah.
But then as adults, we have to actually wait, we were living from here on up in our mind and we can dissociate. I'm really good at that. And we have to actually go back down into our body and say, sweet body, what are you feeling? How are you? What message can you tell me? Because we can't really love this beautiful creation that we are until we trust its messages.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
often, at least in my case, I was living here analytically. I would reason away everything and I'd ignore the messages. And I think that's part of why I got breast cancer and Crohn's because my body was screaming in that medical school environment, which was so harsh for my sensitive soul. But I was like, oh, I got to push through this and work these crazy hours and shut up and behave to my body. And then I had to reintegrate and say, oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I was really mean to you. Let's get to know one another and start to heal this relationship.
It's interesting you mentioned, it was one of the things I was going to ask about. It's interesting you mentioned kind of the impact of medical school training on kind of a sense and an empath on it. You would be kind of feeling for the patients that you were seeing, and there was it not only wasn't there any time for it, but it seemed it really wasn't kind of acceptable. And is that accurate? Yeah.
Yes.
So how have you, as a doctor, as a healer, as a physician, how have you merged that sensitive soul, that empathy, with being able to deal with some patients who are facing really challenging things?
Yeah, well, like I said earlier, we're taught to have this shade over our eyes or kind of like a film where we couldn't really interact at some level. And I've learned, I mean, if I'm really listening and intent and someone's telling me a difficult story, I'll cry. And I'm no longer ashamed before, I'd be like, oh my gosh, don't you dare cry in front of a patient. What are you thinking? Like that's the kind of medical training we had. And now I'm like, if I'm really intent listening, they're sharing something really deep. I'm like, I can't help, right? But then that emotional sharing, I mean, they know I'm really hearing them and I understand and I'm feeling them. And I'm no
Yes.
longer ashamed of that because I feel like that is our human connection. And for a patient to really, so many of my patients have been other places and maybe not been heard or been dismissed. And so for them to really know that it's a place that's safe and that they're also going to be heard is really empowering for them as well.
I think, I mean, you would know far better than I. I think I remember reading years ago that after 9/11, there was some article on the New York Times somewhere. I remember reading that the patient experience had changed immediately after 9/11 because doctors were so impacted as well. So they were opened up emotionally.
Yeah. Wow.
And there was a period after 9/11 where, to your point, like doctors weren't in it with them, right? They were
Yeah.
crying, they were kind of showing
Yeah.
their emotions. There wasn't
Right.
the wall. Yeah.
Right.
And patients felt it and felt like, Paul, is that they were, um, it was welcome. Let me say that. Yeah.
Yeah. Gosh. Yeah,
Like
because it's
that's
an
a very
old
special.
paternalistic model that doesn't
Yes.
work anymore. And thank goodness there's more. Sadly, women are more empathetic generally. I don't want to
Mm,
stereotype, but in general, women do have this gift a little bit more than men. Men can condition it, and a lot of wonderful male doctors have that. But fortunately, I think things are shifting,
mhm.
but medical training is still in the dark ages.
Which is to kind of
Yeah.
put up that, yeah,
Mhm.
because the thinking is that you are better able to,
The thinking is in crisis, you want to maintain objectivity.
yeah,
But it's interesting because like I know this about myself. If someone were to, have an arm amputated right in front of me or something, in crisis, I can be great. And I have an empathetic heart, but I can turn on the like, oh my gosh, what do we need to do? Stop the
yes,
bleeding, do the airway, whatever.
yeah,
That's there. And I think that's trained into us. So it doesn't mean that we can't be great physicians objectively, but I think the reasoning is that, oh, you lose your objectivity.
yeah,
But the truth is we're all human, so that's all a myth anyway that we're perfectly objective.
yes. No, I love that you're sharing this. I was saying to a client recently, um, they were saying something about me being helpful, and I said the only reason why is because I work this same stuff in myself.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
not that, and I'm working it all the
Yes. Yes.
time.
In the process. Totally.
um, Was it difficult as you were writing this, Dr. Jill? Was it difficult to revisit? Because again, the book is so kind of emotionally, we hear this word all the time, vulnerable, but it's really, there's an openness to it that's beautiful. Um, and you not only revisit kind of illness, but also really challenging dating relationships. I mean,
Yeah.
really challenging dating relationships, a divorce.
Yeah.
Was it difficult to revisit these things?
Yes. And it's funny because it's so like I look back, I don't know if I've ever thought about this question either. You're really good at this. Because no,
I don't want
truly.
to put you on the spot. It's just where
No,
my brain goes. Yeah.
it's perfect because the book, February 20, let's see, it was out 2023, so it would have been 21, I think. I thought the book was done, ready to go to the editor and final publishing. And there's a good friend that was involved in the process that's like, nope, this isn't you. This isn't enough. And she kind of made me go back to the drawing board. I didn't rewrite the book, but I really, really, really took nothing for granted. And I marked out and wrote and rewrote, and it turned out to be a different book then. And part of it was like going to that place of being so vulnerable that I was like terrified,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
where I knew I had to be. And it's so funny because the movie is just exactly the same way. We did this beautiful piece and it was all, rosy and it was nice and it was kind of vulnerable. And then the director, producer, and I were like, no, this isn't it. We literally had to refilm a few scenes and then and they have now in the movie this scene I call the ugly cry that I was like, every time I see it, I like cringe because it's
Cringe.
so
Right.
like raw and it's real, but it was just like,
Yeah.
it's so ugly. But the truth is, when I see that, I still almost cry myself because I see that girl that's talking about her pain and suffering and cancer. And I feel with her and it's so real. There was no script. And so it's beautiful because people seeing that feel the same thing that I feel. Is like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you went through that as a medical student. But we had to get to that place with both the book and the movie because that's the only place where we can really touch humanity is being that raw and vulnerable.
So what would you say? Because there's nothing really in our society that says go in that direction. Like you went and you are in a direction that is right. To your point about medical school training, it's not where we're encouraged to go. So what would you say about how and where you found the courage? And what would you say to other leaders in their fields about the where to find the courage for them? And is there a dial there for circumstance?
Yes, so true. Because we have to be willing to go outside the box. Society, our parents, our ancestors, our situations, our jobs put us in this box. I was writing the book and I was like, how do I describe this? Because as a child, I came out of the womb with vibrancy and kind of a little craziness, a little bit hippie, like all these qualities. And I
I
came
remember you saying that. I came out like a hippie. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
I was this really Midwest, like this family that I grew up in was very Midwestern, very traditional values, very like, don't be too loud, don't be too obnoxious, I remember, I'll tell you this, I've never told anyone this, especially not on a podcast. At like a 5-year-old in church, I had these fancy pants, which mean they had ruffles on the butt. and they were just in case the dress would like, in the wind or something.
Yeah.
I literally would bend over on the bench and like, because I want to show everybody my fancy pants. And I got scolded so bad. And so of course I learned that women don't, girls don't do that. Girls don't show their fancy pants
Yeah.
in church. And now I'm like, oh, I like this. I like a
Yeah.
little fancy pants and my sparkly roller skates and whatever. And so
Right.
but that was my just like youthful, innocent joyfulness of showing off my ruffles, right? But I got told as a girl, like that wasn't okay. And so we often get put in these boxes. And back to your question, we have to be our authentic self, even if the world tells us it's too much, it's not enough. And my dial, I learned from 5-year-old in church to dial it down to about a 5 out of 10, where I was out of the womb a 10 out of 10, but it got dialed down, right? Now
Yeah.
I live pretty vibrantly and I just do what I like to do. I have pink hair and all these kinds of things because that's me. I love to be joyful and
Yeah.
I love to encourage patients, workers, employers, employees, any healthcare. We need to really be outside the box and be our authentic selves. And that's where discoveries happen. That's where curiosity happens. That's where the world change happens.
Mhm.
So I love that.
Yeah, I think it takes real, when we talk about vulnerability and authenticity, the courage piece is often missing in that conversation because in so many industries and in business, it's bucking the tide, bucking the
Yes.
system to show up authentic. To your point about medical school, you don't cry when your patient is, you know,
Right.
struggling.
Yeah,
But in fact, it's exactly that the patient, you know, gives a sense that, oh, we're in this together. This person gets me.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah, which makes all the difference. All right, I'm just mindful of our time here. So I think I have covered most of the things. So I have two kind of questions. So your journey has been, um, you've had some significant bumps, Dr. John. Like, um, just your health journey alone would be would be regarded as pretty challenging, like a mountain to climb. And I know, in the book you talk about rock climbing, mountain climbing. Were there ever times when you thought, gee whiz, this is just too hard? Like, what the dickens is going
I'm pausing because the one thing that I think is, we all have strengths and weaknesses, and I have many, many, many weaknesses. But somewhere deep inside of me, from very, very, very young, I had this immense faith. And again, when I say faith, it's just like the ability to know that there's maybe some other options, or maybe this is possible to overcome, or that I could dream big. And it's really just believing that something else is possible other than what we see. So just if we have that, vision of this is all I see, this feels hopeless, I could always jump and say, and maybe it was as a young girl, I love to imagine, I love to, dissociate in my head. But that faith gift, I feel like is a gift and it's something I can loan to others because I don't remember any times. Again, I've had lots of weaknesses, lots of struggle, but I've always had a deep faith. And that has totally carried me through so many difficult times.
on? Mm-hmm.
I don't remember ever feeling so hopeless that I didn't believe there was a way out.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't hear that in the book, and there was challenge after challenge
Yeah.
after challenge, and I mean, there's obviously a lot of wonderful stuff too. But
Yeah.
just if you look at your health journey, it's no joke. I mean,
Yeah.
just that is no joke.
Mhm.
And so, and what I think I mentioned this at the top of the conversation. What was interesting to me was even in the hardest part of the challenges, you were looking for how can I stretch? These are my words. How can I stretch? How can I learn? I mean, you were constantly saying, "What's here for me?"
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I was curious if there were ever a moment when you said, "Ooh, this is like a little
I
much."
mean, don't get me wrong, there was times when I hated it. I did
Yeah.
not. I so wanted out of the suffering, and I was
Yeah.
like, "This is horrible."
Yeah.
But as far as ever really darkly despairing,
Yeah.
no. And again, I've had many other weaknesses, but this is
Well,
probably the one strength. Yeah.
it's a really inspirational narrative. And so if people want to find the book, is Amazon the best place to get
Yeah.
it? Or yeah.
Yep.
And it's on Audible because they can hear you. They can hear you narrate it, which is really fantastic because it adds a whole other dimension to the scenes. Like they're imprinted. So many of them are imprinted with me because I hear you
You
tell.
heard me tell it. Yes.
So the last question as we wind down here that I like to ask all interviewees, all participants in the Making Magnificence project is, what does magnificence mean to you in your own life?
That's, I'm going to say something funny. I think it's the dialing up 10 out of 10 and showing your fancy pants.
Yeah, that's the best answer ever. I'm gonna put that in the trailer for the podcast. Show your fancy pants. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is because it's like that joy. And the thing is, so often as a young girl or young boy, we're just pure and innocent coming from this wealth of who we were born to be. And we're told by somebody we're too much or we're not enough. And then those messages stick. And that's what we have to fix with the trauma piece. But if you can go back to your 5-year-old self, what brought you the most joy? What did you love to do? What excited you when you woke up in the morning? That's probably what you should be doing right now, whether it's dancing or roller skating or creating or writing or any of those things.
That's fantastic. My guest today has been Dr. Jill Carnahan. And Dr. Jill, if people want to learn more about you, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so book, documentary, all the links are at jillcarnahan.com. And if you want to watch the movie, please check it out. It's brand new out, drpatientmovie.com.
Totally gonna check that out. You said it's coming out, what,
April
April?
19th.
Okay. Well, my guest today has been Dr. Jill Carnahan, MD. Thank you so much, Dr. Jill, for this conversation.
You're welcome, Sarah. It was an absolute pleasure.